second part of a three-part series we're doing. Today we're talking about accessible web content. I'm going to put the next slide on the screen as I talk a little bit more. Let me just move this out of the way. So my name is Jason. I work for Rutgers Access. I'm sorry, I work for Rutgers Office of IT Accessibility. I've recently moved offices, and my job here really is to make sure that all of our digital assets at the university is accessible. I previously worked on our student side of the house, and my role now is kind of expanded to be university-wide. We have a couple of resources for you to follow along with. The first is we have a wiki, and everything we talk about today is going to be on that wiki. So all of the style guides we go over, all the topics regarding fonts and font styles and links and everything we talk about today, you can find a more deeper dive into the regulations and into what is required on this wiki. So you can use that to follow along, or you can use that as a enhanced reading guide. I want to thank ATAC and Jesse, Naomi, and Mike for inviting me. And if you have any questions or anything, feel free to shoot it in the chat, raise your hand. I will be monitoring it periodically. So before we get started, we are going to be playing a game. If you ever played Dungeons and Dragons before, you'll pick up quickly. And if you've never played it at all, don't worry, because it's nothing like that at all. And in this, just before we get started, for those who have played Dungeons and Dragons, you're human. You have the standard range of abilities that humans have. This isn't, I don't want to see any throwing fireballs. And so what you're going to do is you're going to write in the chat what you would like the character to do. And we're going to go through a very short story with everyone. So the sky looks great today, and you're running a little bit late for work and definitely should have worn more layers. You stop by IT to pick up a laptop, and you're greeted by a person at the front desk. With a warm smile, she says, "Hello, adventurer. I can't remember where I parked. Will you help me?" And so you kind of have to write yes or no in the chat. Preferably yes, so this is going to be a very short presentation. So go ahead. Yes, excellent. So, you head out to the parking lot, and the door locks behind you. As you look through the glass, you see Priscilla disappear like a ghost. There's several rows of cars in the parking lot. In your inventory, you have just one key. And on the screen, there's 3 hearts, but that doesn't mean anything. That's just for stylistic purposes only. What do you do? And it's going to play some music as you think about what you'd like to do to solve this problem of finding Priscilla's car. And so while the music plays, think about it and then write your answer in the chat of what you would like Mario to do. This will last just for a couple seconds. All right, so we have look at the key. What model is it? It is a standard key. It looks like a skeleton key. You don't know what she drives. You don't have it's just a key. There's no fob. And you can't call her because you don't have a phone. You just have the key. That's all you have in your inventory. Start trying every key on every car. Okay, so you put the first key in the first car, nothing happens. You put the second key in the second car, nothing happens. Third and fourth in every single car until finally the key enters the car and the door opens. You get inside, however, it won't start, but there is a note on the seat. And on the seat, you also find a cell phone, which should be pretty useful. All right, this is round 2 of 3. So on the screen is a standard parking lot. There are 5 rows of cars. The first row closest to you is labeled red zone, next green, the following 2 are yellow, and the last is blue. There are 10 cars per row. Each spot is labeled 1 to 3 repeating. You have a key and you have a cell phone that you can only call Priscilla. What do you do? There's no music on this one. I don't think there's music on this one. You've got a phone that can call Priscilla. Okay, so we're gonna call her. So you call Priscilla and she says, "Hello, adventure. I remember a yellow sign. I think I was parked in spot 3. I'm not really sure. It was very early. Listen, I've got to go. My phone's about to die." Um, well, they're all blue cars. So uh, so we head to our yellow zone and we try every spot 3 until finally the door opens. You turn it on, but again, the car won't budge. You hear the radio come on and it says, "This is your daily horoscope. Mario, your car is in the next parking lot. Keep going, my friend." So, oh, and you also found a key fob. That should be useful. Um, so you're in the same exact parking lot, except now you have a key fob. Your phone that can only call Priscilla is now dead. Um, the key fob has a hazard button that will flash lights and a panic button that will make alarm noises only. What do you do? Panic button. So you push the panic button and there's a loud wind that prevents you from being able to triangulate where it's coming from. Push panic button. You push the hazard button. Um, and you begin to see lights now flashing in the distance. That does it. You're able to see where the car is. You immediately head to the car. You turn the ignition, and finally the car turns on. As you listen to the sound of the sweet engine purr, you think to yourself, "Man, that was harder than I thought it would be." And in case you've never beaten Mario, this is what the end screen looks like. So we're going to keep in mind our experience of all this, and we're going to kind of talk about screen reader users. But when we talk about accessibility, there's a range of disabilities that may impact a person's ability to use web content. The one we talk about most often tends to be, those who are blind who uses what's called a screen reader to access that web content. And a screen reader basically is a software that allows you to interact with the elements on the screen. So it's more than just a one-way interaction like a text-to-speech reader where you can only hear. A screen reader allows you to identify what the element is and then be able to perform an action as you would with your mouse. And so in that first level where you didn't know where the car was, in order to find it, you had to look through every single car to get there. And that's really what we call like your base level, level 1 JAWS user. You use your tab and your arrow keys. You're basically going through every single element on the page. And so if I press my arrow key, it's going to go, Rutgers is going to say image, Rutgers, image, I don't know, students on a lawn, heading 1, title of page. So it's going to read out that this is a heading. It'll read out image, which is the element type, image of a chess piece, and then it's going to read out the text underneath of what that says. And you're going to do that for every single element. And so if you can imagine trying to find something on a page, right, and not knowing where that was on the page or if it exists on the page, having to read this out by every single word on the page in order to hopefully find what you're looking for, that could be a very daunting task, similar to like level 1, where we had to go through every single car. And it wasn't just looking at the car, like there was work that you had to do in order to figure out like, oh, is this the thing that I'm looking for on this page, or does that even exist on this page? The second level of screen reader users, the one that's most common in terms of their skill level, is you can open up a list of elements, right? So on this page, we have headings because we've coded things correctly as headings. And so we can open up our rotator. So with NVDA, that's caps lock F7 or insert F7. And we can be able to pull up a list of headings. And so for those of you old enough to remember newspapers and buying the newspaper in the morning, you jump to like, the comic section. You'd be able to see visually that the newspaper was broken up into different sections and jump to the one that you needed. Similarly, with your headings, provided that they're coded as headings, I can be able to see, well, there's a section for news and tips, there's a section for services, there's a section for quick forms, and be able to jump to services. Now, much like in level 2, though, of our game, if everything is just coded as click here, so let's say you have a list of links and they just say click here, click here, click here, there's nothing letting that screen reader know what that pertains to. And that was kind of like us labeling all the spots as O3. Okay, we were able to identify the links, but it wasn't very useful to us just to know that this was an O3 spot because all the spots were labeled as O3. And so in this same case, like, we really don't know what register now pertains to because all we're doing is opening up a list of those links. We're not hearing the full context of that sentence, right? And so where the sentence may have said, register now for our webinar on, checking web accessibility, all the screen reader is going to hear in this view is register now. And we're
Jason,
going to
I have a
talk,
question. This is Jesse.
go ahead.
So are you saying that there has to be an appropriate level of text in the headings in order for the screen readers to be effective? Is that what
Yeah.
you're trying to hit home
Yes.
here?
Yes. And so here with the headings but also the links, we're going to talk later about, using descriptive text, right, in your link. So instead of saying register now, you can say, register now for our, web accessibility training. And if you make that whole sentence a link, that whole sentence will show up in this list of links. But we're going to talk a little bit more about uh the requirements for links in a moment. This is really just to get you an idea of how do people actually use a screen reader and what do they experience. So before we start, there's a couple of things you want to think about in terms of your web content. And the first is the context and delivery. And so we have a couple of like live cases here at Rutgers. And I'm not trying to throw shade. These are just things that, I've seen. The first is, taking something that was meant for a digital world and bringing it into the physical world. And so in this case, we have this button that says, and I forget where this came from. I think this was it was like a suicide prevention campaign. And they came up with this kind of like a see something, say something campaign where they had this button on a ton of these websites, which was great. But then what they did is they created magnets of these buttons. I remember walking into my office and I went to my department admin and there was these magnets on our front desk and it just said click here to share a concern. And I remember me being a smart aleck, I kept pushing on it, go, it's not doing anything. And she looked at me and she looked at the magnet. She was like, oh, I get it. And so that was a good case of like, this is a really great thing for a digital platform, but it doesn't really make sense without an adaptation for the physical world. And we see the same in reverse happen often where we take something that was meant for the physical world and we try to just throw it up in the digital world, right? And so on the screen is a flyer that I'm sure was a beautiful flyer with the Rutgers red. I'm sure the text was very big that people could see it. But what ended up happening is they saved this poster as an image and just threw it up on a web page. And because it didn't scale right, because now the text is smaller, because the image isn't of great quality, it became more difficult not only for a sighted person to see this, but nearly impossible for someone who uses a screen reader to be able to access that same information. And so we have to be mindful, in most cases, that we're not taking something that was originally intended for that physical world and just throwing it up in the digital space without really thinking about the consequences of that. The next is design and layout. Um, and in that web page, what I have is, this poster set. And this came from a university in Canada, and it outlines different design choices for different types of people with disabilities, right? I think when we think about web accessibility, we often think about it as a very technical thing where a lot of it really is encompassed by making smarter decisions. And those smarter decisions about how we lay out information and how we design the information becomes more usable for all your users, not just those of that specific disability category. And so I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but these are things like using simple colors instead of high contrast, these high bright neon colors, writing in plain language, do this, opposed to using things like it's raining cats and dogs, which may not translate into other cultural, backgrounds. We had a person who was deaf who, she communicated via sign language, and we had a coordinator who used that idiom of, oh, it's raining cats and dogs, and she kind of looked at us because in the deaf culture that phrase doesn't make any sense. Um, you want to use simple sentences and bullets instead of creating this giant wall of text, which may make it difficult not only to navigate visually on your page, but for someone with dyslexia, it makes it more difficult to access what it is you're writing. Make buttons descriptive. And again, I'm not going to go through all of this, but this page really outlines a lot of these like very simple do's and don'ts for each one of these disability types, like using good color contrast, you know, using aligning the text left, really keeping your content short, clear, and simple. Um, and again, this is just a reference for you to go to after this presentation. But what I want to stress is good design practices go a long way, and they require zero code knowledge. Um, the next is, consider what happens when you click send or publish your content. In a lot of cases, what I see is someone will create something in a platform, let's call it Canva, or, let's call it, Adobe or Word, and then they will change that format to a PDF, or they will use that tool to then create something, for a web platform like Canvas or your website. And they haven't really thought about the accessibility in that end format. And so we can't assume that because we built something in a tool like Word, that all those accessibility components are going to carry over if we copy and paste into a WikiWig editor or that we save as a PDF. Because a lot of times things get lost in translation. And so before we start diving deeper into these different elements, I just want to put it out there that it's very important that we're taking that final product and basing our accessibility and checking the accessibility in the final format that is going to be presented to either your end users, your students, your faculty, whatever it might be. Um, so the first thing we're going to talk about is fonts and text. You want to avoid using images as text. And we're going to talk about images in a little bit, but if there is text within an image, it's important that you're writing that out in the alt text. Um, Two, you want to use sans serif font. So a serif font has these little curly cues at the bottom of it. And there is a plethora of fonts. And so I don't want to just paint this as black and white of like, don't use serif fonts, use sans serif. But like, you really want to look at that font and avoid anything that appears to be too decorative in nature, right? Like you want to use um, l- fonts where the letters are clearly distinguishable from each other. And so like an E looks very different like than an I, right? And a capital I looks very different than a one. Um, and these include things like Area, Verdana. I've listed a few of them in the sheet, that GitHub site I put at the start of the presentation, just for you to look at. Fonts should be at least 12 to 14 point font or equivalent. Depending on the font you use, they don't always line up correctly in terms of like a 12-point font in this font is the equivalent to a 12-point font in this other one. And so just the general rule of thumb, though, is that it should be at least 12 to 14-point font. You want to limit the number of fonts you use in a document, and try to stay within two to three, and that's just good design practices. And you want to avoid using all capital letters like I've done here, because it makes it more difficult to read. in terms of color contrast, you definitely don't want to solely rely on color to convey meaning. And I think a lot of us understand this conceptually, but we don't think about how it translates in practice to things like our charts and graphs, right? I think we look at it as, well, I'm not going to have a red background and then have like a black text on that, or I'm sorry, like a light red text on that, because it doesn't have enough color contrast. But then we start looking at things like, charts where every bar in that chart is a different color and it pertains to a different thing. We tend to not think about it as so granular. And so really think about not just the content on the page, but also the color contrast within, the image and other elements you're adding on that page. And there's a tool called WebAIM's color contrast checker. And I'll briefly show it to you. Essentially, what it allows you to do it allows you to take any two colors on your screen. And so if I wanted to pick this pink color and I wanted to pick this white, I can examine those two colors against each other, and it's going to give me whether or not that ratio meets color contrast. Um, there are other tools like Wave, and there's other like these automated tools. A lot of times you may get false positives on those tools simply because of the way that it's checking it. For example, we use a tool to automatically scan through our sites. It basically crawls through every single link and every single page on our site. And a lot of times, what will happen is it will check the site before the site is fully loaded, or it will look at it based on the code and go, well, because this layer is above this layer, it looks like it's not meeting color contrast, but when the page fully loads, that isn't the case. And so those things really need to be manually checked. In the next presentation we do, part three of this, we're going to go over how to check your website. But I just want to stress that not all things can be automated, right? And there's a couple of things like color contrast that you really need to think about in terms of what you're checking, because even the automated checker is not going to be looking at your images and then the way that the colors are presented in your images. Um, in terms of checking with a screen reader, for color contrast, I don't use a screen reader to check for color contrast. What I use is the WebAIM color contrast checker. Um, and in our next presentation, we'll go over how to look at that. Um, the next is headings and navigation. So headings should follow a logical order. And so when you think about your website, really want to think about it as if you had created an outline of your page, right? And so headings should go heading one, and then heading two should be nested under heading one. And you could have as many headings twos nested under heading one, and your heading threes nested under your heading twos. What you want to avoid is skipping those levels, right? So it doesn't make sense for you to have a heading level three nested under a heading one. Um, and you also want to avoid having blank headings. And that happens a lot as you edit your website, especially in a content management system where like you may delete text, but then the system goes, well, you left this space here. This space must be a heading, right? Because the content management system doesn't know. It's only reading the code behind it, and you did leave an element there. Um, um, and then you want to be concise and descriptive. And so you want to avoid like very long, lengthy headings. Not only does it, tend to break things when you try to do things like reflow your page or reflow a menu, um, but also like it makes it very confusing for the screen reader user. And you want to be consistent across pages. So whatever navigation you have, you want to make sure that you're being consistent with that headings and those things across all your pages, especially for a screen reader user. They really rely on being able to know, like, okay, this is how the page is laid out. I don't need to re-examine the page because I understand on every page there's going to be I don't know, an event section, right? And the event section is going to come after the resource section. So whether I'm looking at, I don't know, the anime club versus the chess club, I can be able to find the information I need quickly because I already know how the things are laid out. The next is links and buttons. So link text should be descriptive, meaningful, and concise. Um, the link should also be visually apparent to users. And so this takes us back to the color. Oftentimes, what we see is people will use color as a means of basically visually identifying those links. And then you fall into a trap of using now color for meaning. And so anytime you have a link, there should be some other way of distinguishing that as a link visually without the use of color. And in most cases, you find that people will underline that link. And so visually on a page, you can go, this is a link. If it is linked to an external site, best practices are that you should indicate to the user they're leaving the page. And if you're gonna print materials, you can have the full name of the URL in parentheses. However, for like digital content on the web, you want to avoid links that are your full standard HTTP colon backslash backslash link here, and instead use a descriptive name, like link to ATAC. Um,
So,
tables. Sorry, go ahead.
sorry, Jason, this is Jesse again. I just want to be clear on this. You're saying that the screen reader will be able, if you have a decent amount of description in your by the link, the screen reader will be able to decipher the difference between regular text and then telling the person who uses the screen reader, this this text here is a link. It's going to take you somewhere else.
Yes, yes. So the screen reader is going to read the element, and so if it's coded as a link, it's going to read link, and then it's going to read the text that you've basically have put within that link tag. And so you can put as much text as you want in theory, for that link. But what it's going to do is going to read link and then that text that you put. So yes.
Okay.
Um, tables. So, a couple of things to avoid. Definitely do not use tables to create layouts on your page. We see this often. Tables are kind of hard for screen readers to navigate as a whole. Screen readers are very RAM intensive, meaning that like it uses a lot of memory in your computer to run it. And tables which have a lot of information, a lot of different elements, become very difficult for that screen reader to like operate and use. And so if you can use a list instead of a table, it's always recommended to use a list. The W3C has a guide to how to make accessible tables. And in this guide, it pretty much gives you every single type of table you can possibly imagine, and then it will show you how to code that table correctly such that the screen reader is going to be able to read that correctly. And that's going to be in the PowerPoint slide, but as well as the GitHub site we sent. Um, and so if you have to code a table, I would definitely use this as a resource. What you're going to find is that like you need to appropriately identify your heading rows and your heading columns in a meaningful way that the screen reader is going to be able to interact with that. And so if you think about like a statistics table where there's so many rows and so many columns and it's all just numbers, that becomes very difficult for a screen reader user to keep all that in their head. And so identifying those headings appropriately allows the screen reader to read, I'm at basically give you an XY coordinate system of, you're at, your top level heading is 2024, and this is, I don't know, pieces served, whatever that left column heading is, and know exactly where you are on that table at all times. Back to the PowerPoint. Um, and then, because a lot of times you're keeping a lot of information in your head when you're trying to navigate these tables, breaking them up into smaller, simple tables instead of one gigantic, large one is always better. Um, I want to talk about AI a little bit. So when you talk about images, um, and the first thing I want to talk about is, don't let AI gaslight you. So sometimes what happens is when you take something from Google, you take something from, the internet, and you copy and paste it into an electronic document, like let's say it's Word, let's say, it's in a WikiWiki editor. Sometimes what it does is it will import the alt text associated with it, the metadata. And tools like Google, in order to be more accessible, what they do is they take the heading of the page. And so in this case, I imported an image, a pixelated image of Mario, and the imported art alt text came in as Super Mario Brothers pixel icon by Beatus on DeviantArt. Um, and when you use an automated checker, something like this is going to be difficult for it to go, well, that isn't a real alt text. And so when we talk about in our next session about checking for web accessibility, things like this become important that you're double checking that there is an alt text and that alt text is appropriate. And maybe you may have gotten away with the first one, but like the second one, just says 940 free CCO bird stock photos, right? Like, which isn't a very useful description. A lot of these tools are now doing auto-generated image descriptions. And so if you import this image into PowerPoint, and you didn't have a like you took a screenshot of this and you just put it into PowerPoint, what it gave you was a pixelated video game character, which is pretty good. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't provide any information about why that image itself exists or any context around that image because it doesn't know. And the same with the orange bird is the blue and orange bird is, I may be presenting about finches and this may be a very rare species of finch that I'm showing and like it just says a blue and orange bird. Um and it is I will say AI has gotten a whole lot better at taking an image and providing a usable description as a starting point. The point I want to make with this slide is we just have to be careful in terms of where we're getting image from and know that sometimes there's metadata coming along with it. And, just because something isn't showing up as an error doesn't mean that it's not in fact an error. And so anytime we import an image, anytime we're using an image, whether that be in a WikiWiki editor, whether that be in an electronic document like Word or PowerPoint, we need to make sure that we are manually checking what that alt text is. Um, and also don't gaslight yourself. I think um, people have good intentions, right? And they hear, hey, someone might be blind and we need to have a description of this image so that you can go out and be able to know what this image is. And so in this case we had someone send out this holiday card via email to all of our users at Rutgers, and it just said warm wishes from Rutgers. And what they did is they just made that into one giant image, right? Because they wanted to look pretty and they wanted to appear the same way for everyone, right? Which is why we see this happen, right? And so what they did was they made it all an image, but there was no alt text because in their mind they said, "Well, I have the alt text down below. I put an image description down there." What they didn't realize is like that text was part of the image, and so there was no way for that screen reader to access that. And so when things like this come up, oftentimes what I end up getting is a flurry of emails of, "Oh, did you see this? Can you reach out to so and so?" But I think it's important that as a community, there can be community discussions with one another. Say, hey, I noticed you put an image description. Did you know that a screen reader can't read that if you include it in the image itself? Right. And I think these peer to peer conversations is where a lot of the movement forward is going to actually happen. Oh, and then on this, you can't see it well, but that's the point. On the right side of the screen, also take into account mobile, right? So in this case, the text of the body of the email, reflowed, but the image did not, right? And so you also have to consider, well, how is this going to look on multiple types of devices because today most people are accessing content via their mobile phone than they are a laptop. And even within the mobile phone space, there's a lot of different screen sizes and a lot of different operating systems. So we have to be just mindful of, not only are they accessing it in different ways, but on different devices. Um, so I'm going to pause for a second and ask a question. So, what was the lesson level three? So, we talked about, lesson level one of our game, Mario, was about this idea of, well, if I have to navigate word by word to find something or card by card, that's going to take a very long time, right? So, it's important that we're identifying elements like headings and links and graphics, right? And in level two, we learned that not only is it important to, identify all of our elements, right? But we also need to have usable and descriptive text when we do that, right? So it can't just be, click here. Like it needs to be something usable that that person can be able to uniquely identify this element from the next. So what do you think was the lesson in level three where we had the car fob? You can put it in the chat. Any thoughts? Give it another minute, another 2 seconds. So the lesson in that third level of that Mario game was that you needed to have multiple means of expression and representation because sometimes the original method of displaying and relaying information may not be the one that that person is able to access, right? And so in that game, there was two options. There was a car fob. Sorry, there was a panic button, and then there was a button to like light up the hazard lights, right? And no matter which one you picked, I would tell you that didn't work, and the second one worked, um, because you know whether we're talking about videos, right? And someone who can't hear the audio and may need closed captions, whether we're talking about images and someone who can't see, and may need an alt text to be able to read the uh the um the metadata behind it, you know, whether we're talking about someone who can't navigate with a mouse and needs to navigate with a keyboard only, what we're really boiling this down to is having multiple means of expressing those elements. And so, you know, on the screen we have an image that we're going to talk about in a moment, but just some general guidelines of like how to make good alt text. One, always alt text your image unless they're decorative only. Two, a good alt text should understand the context and the audience. It should also be concise and objective, right? It shouldn't be a three-page dissertation, right? Because if you think about it, now I have to read your page, and now you've basically shifted my focus to this very long essay about what this image is, and now I've forgotten what my point was on the page. And sometimes a short description isn't enough, and so sometimes we need to provide a longer description when necessary. And lastly, it's okay to convert an image into a more usable format, for example, a graph of a table under the image. And so in this case, we have Princess Peach standing next to Bowser in the Rain, recreating the bus stop scene from My Neighbor Totoro, which is a famous Studio Ghibli film. And what you may have noticed is, I didn't mention, that Toad was on her back. I didn't mention that they were, that the flagpole had like a little Bowser, black flag on it, because that wasn't relevant to the context of what this presentation was and why I was showing this picture, right? The context of this picture and the concise thing for you to understand what this picture is just is Princess Peach standing next to Bowser in the rain. Um, okay, and then what happens? Um, so I do want to talk a little bit about Title 2. We have a little bit of time. I only have one more slide. I wanted to leave at least 15 minutes for questions. Um, But as you all are probably aware, the DOJ put out updated regulations about web and mobile accessibility. And basically, what it says is that all of your web content, all your mobile content, whether that's behind an authentication wall or not, needs to meet WCAG 2.1 AA standards. And, depending on your role, you know, that's going to impact you differently in your response to that. Um, and what we have found here at Rutgers is that the field of web accessibility, when we talk about a website or a digital asset, there are multiple people with overlapping spheres that falls under, right? You have your IT developers, and those are people who are coders. Maybe they can edit your template in Drupal or WordPress. You've got your webmasters, and sometimes they're IT people, sometimes they're not. Sometimes there's just someone who's tech savvy who was able to purchase a WordPress account for you, right? You have your web administrators, and oftentimes these are people who are being asked to update the site, right? These are people who may or may not have any tech skills, but their role involves communication of some sort, and this is part of their job. And then you have these contributors, which are non-web roles. And what we find often with those things that are attached to websites, your PDFs, right, that, or even your web content, we find a varying paths of how that gets online, right? And in a lot of cases, is these contributors going, "Hey, I've got this workshop happening. Here's my PowerPoint. Can you post it online?" And they're sending it to the web administrator, who all they know is basically how to use a WikiWig editor or like a web editor within a content management tool like Drupal or WordPress. And all they're doing is they're editing one small little tiny section of that website, right? And so as we think about our plans, for web accessibility and who should know, who should be trained, and we have to think about all the actors in this, right? Because I feel like what ends up happening is a lot of this work ends up going, well, you're the web admin, therefore it's your responsibility, but they don't have any access to the actual end content. Like they're not content creators. And so I don't know who's out there, if you're a web administrator, you're a webmaster, you're IT developer, or you're a contributor, but I wanted to lay that landscape to let people know that this equation is a lot broader than people I think have made it to be. And it's going to require a conversation with all those players to be able to address all the issues, right? And so even within our web scans, we have found a lot of issues where that web administrator, not only don't they have the technical ability, they also don't have the permissions, right? Or the correct access to be able to fix things in a template, right? And so if you're a DSO office working on this, I would really strongly encourage you not to just think about this as who's updating your website, but like who's all the players involved in being able to put that website online. Um, and in our next presentation, I have 2 more minutes. In our next presentation, we're going to go over how to check for accessibility using a free tool, Wave. But we'll also show you a couple of other plugins and whatnot to allow you to be able to do spot checks on a page. Um, oh, this was basically just, depending on who you are on your on this scale, your needs may be different for that web tool. And that one's really designed for your web administrators, your content providers. But it is also going to be useful for your IT developers and webmasters. However, the tools that they need should be a lot more exclusive, um, and they should be a lot more complicated because on their role, they need to be able to do things on a larger scale. And so for our next train, we're focusing on the second half of this grid, for people to do spot checks and people who don't really have an IT background to be able to do this in the easiest way possible. And that's our show. Thank you for watching. This is my email. You're always welcome to reach out to me via email if you have questions. Shameless plug, we have a podcast on Spotify called Uncaptioned Conversations. Feel free to subscribe to it. We basically invite people with disabilities. We invite people who are tangential to the accessibility field to talk about all the topics under the sun, whether that be procurement, website development, you know, the law, whatever it is, their experiences. And we use this as a platform to start conversations. Um, but that is our show. I'm going to open things up to questions. Are there any questions that anyone has? I'm going to stop sharing. Stop sharing. And you can feel free to put it in the chat. You can raise your hand. Um, Yes, what I can do is I will we'll send it out in the email to everyone, that way you have it. If you give me a second, I will also put that main document, the GitHub, in the chat. So you have it. But all that will be included in the PowerPoint and in what we send out afterwards. When is the next webinar? That's a really good question. Naomi, do you know when the next one is? Let me look at my calendar. I believe it is Thursday the 29th at 12 p.m. And we'll send out the link to that as well. So that's going to be the last one, and that's going to be how to do a web audit. So after you've created your content, how to check it. Okay. Well, I can stick around for another couple of minutes. If there's any other questions, thank you guys so much for attending. And if you have any questions, you can always feel free to reach out to us. Naomi, there's a question in the chat. How do we get notified about future trainings? Is there an email list? And then Naomi posted, there is a link, at4nj.org/webinars. All right. Thank you guys for coming. I'll give you back the last 10 minutes of this. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Naomi. I'll send you the